official debate happening. We have Jiva, we have Tamer. For this debate, Jiva's taken the position that consumption of organic dairy products is not wrong. Tamer's taken the opposition. As always, when we based upon who concedes, if we don't get a vocal concession from either participant, we'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can vote on who you think performed better in the debate. There's no time limit, light moderation. You guys can get started.
Great, thanks. So my view is that the concepts of right and wrong or morality can only be based in theism or spiritual philosophy. Otherwise, it's just an opinion. And from what I can tell, there is no religious tradition that says or implies that consuming milk is wrong. In fact, to the contrary, in Eastern religions, milk has been considered one of the primary elements of the typical diet. And Christianity also implies that there's nothing wrong in using animals. Now, I understand that it's going to be somewhat pointless if I don't offer some concession on this position, so I will accept, for the sake of argument, that objective morality can exist outside of theism. But I would argue that this would have to be morally intuitive to the majority of people and also explainable through some kind of evolutionary model. I think most people so for example, I think most people intuitively believe that murder is wrong and theft is wrong. And I'm not necessarily asking for an explanation or justification for those beliefs. I'll accept them. And I can even accept the Kantian categorical imperative there, even though I don't fully agree with it. But I don't think you can use the categorical imperative to justify that consumption of milk is wrong. I certainly don't think the majority of people intuitively believe that consumption of milk is wrong. I don't see how you could argue that we will evolve to think so based on a sort of selfish gene model. So I'm intrigued to know on what grounds that you say consumption of milk is wrong. And hopefully you can explain that. But I think there are three issues which we sort of need to iron out in this discussion. The first being what is wrong. And I would like to know what criteria you are using to determine whether something is right or wrong. Secondly, I would want to know whether it is inherently wrong to use animals or to consume milk, whether there's something inherent in the actual milking process and consumption of milk that is wrong in your view. And thirdly, I would want to know whether you think a consumer is morally responsible for the methods which are used to create the product which he or she consumes. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I would just say that I'm not really big on like meta-ethical discussions. I'm not super versed in philosophy and things like that. So I'm more so going to be focused on like how your position would lead to veganism, and we can talk about you know I guess I'll sort of give an opening statement, and then I'll respond to your to what you said. So I would basically say that in the so first I want to understand why you see factory farming as wrong, because I think we are in agreement that at least factory farming is wrong, and a lot of the ways that we do even organic farming is wrong, because we did talk, like, just to let the audience know, we did talk a little bit earlier today about the debate, and I gave him some insight on what happens in the organic industry, like even like organic basically is just the feed, and they may not be subjected to like hormonal or steroidal injections, but the label basically means nothing for the animal's ethical treatment. So I think for the debate, you mean more like pasture fed or pasture raised, basically. But even in those cases, in majority of those farms, the babies are still being taken away at birth, and the humane standards, like, they include only allowing the cows to graze for only like 4 months out of the year. So the rest of the year they'll be in sheds. It includes the artificial insemination, which is like forcibly extracting, semen from a male cow and then injecting it into a female cow, while also confining her so that she's not able to get away. So I would personally deem this as bestiality and rape. And you could talk about if you disagree with that later on if you'd like, but at the end of the day, regardless of all of those things, even if it were in a case where those things aren't happening, which wouldn't be universalizable. So this, I still would disagree with the prop. I would still say it's wrong because it's not universalizable. Is that how it's gonna? Because they're still being killed and utilized as a product. They're being forcibly bred and killed and utilized as a product and a means to our ends. Essentially, we're deeming them as product value and seeing them as no more than objects at the end of the day, because even though we're like trying to give them this humane treatment, which doesn't really make sense. It's kind of like a double standard, or like it's kind of contradictory. Like we're viewing them as these creatures that should have some sort of ethical value or some sort of moral consideration, but at the same time we're still okay with viewing them as a product whenever we don't need to. And like note that the prop, it actually mentions the word product in it, so we're clearly seeing like this lactation from cows as like an effective food source, which arguably it can be. And you said religious like there's a lot of no religious traditions say that consuming milk is wrong, and Eastern countries like it's one of the primary elements of their diet. It has been in the past and it still is today. But that doesn't mean that it is today. It doesn't mean that we should continue doing it, because obviously we didn't have all of the like the industrialization that we have now. We didn't have access to all of these different nutrients. Like we can get all of the nutrients that we need on a plant-based diet without having to consume dairy, basically. And the reason that these people consumed dairy in the past is because it was a very effective way to just get a lot of nutrients and calories into one small thing, because they weren't consuming nearly as much as much food as we do, and they didn't have access to as much either. So I would say that the idea of it being like in religion, and like, because in all religion they still tell you like be like pay respect to the beings that you're quote unquote like using or whatever. Like we still want to be respectful to them, but I think that entails that once you don't need to use them anymore, the respectful thing to do is to stop doing that, is to stop using them, because we don't need to anymore. We can consume all of our nutrients from plants. We don't need to do this to them anymore. So if we're going to see the problems in factory farming as problems, like I'm assuming that you see that as wrong and immoral and a problem. So I would see it as entirely necessary to, at the very least, recognize that all dairy products are not morally permissible, and recognize them as wrong.
Okay. Can I come in now?
You can. I had a little more to say, but I can wait.
No, sorry, carry on. Sorry, carry on.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, like, why, well, I think I would actually prefer to say this later on, after you give your reasoning for why you think factory farming is wrong, and maybe just give responses to my points, maybe. And just really quick about the you said not everyone like intuitively believes that consumption of milk is wrong. So I would just say that that's just a conditioning. That's a generational conditioning that we've been subjected to. So somebody like me who has not been raised on farming and things like that, I as soon as I was exposed to what occurs for that, I was absolutely horrified. So I don't think that it's natural to look at it and think that it's good. I think most people who look at what happens, they're like, oh, this is kind of gross. Like this doesn't really seem like a good thing. So maybe they don't believe the consumption of milk is wrong, but they do see the process as wrong, at least. So I think that it's just a generational thing, and I think over time we're going to see a shift in that.
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few points there to touch on, but the first thing I would say is that I accept there's probably been a little bit of confusion here, but when I made the proposition, it was specifically referencing the consumption of milk. not the production of milk. And I understand you can't really separate the two, or it's a bit difficult to separate the two. But I was sort of referring to whether actually milking a cow and drinking the, or consuming the milk for your own purposes is in itself inherently wrong or immoral. But
Okay,
I
then I
mean,
guess I was a
yeah,
little
but
bit confused because it says product, so that's what I was writing on.
well,
Like,
dairy products, yeah, it's the consumption of dairy products, not necessarily the means by which they're produced. But I'm happy to go down that route as well. But I'll just respond to a couple of other points you made. Um, You mentioned that milk was previously historically an essential part of diet, but I don't think you can say that because there are many cultures even today that don't really consume milk. We think of the native Aborigines, we can think of lost tribes in the Amazon rainforest and parts of Africa, and they can live quite healthy diets without milk. So I don't think you can assume that all cultures historically needed milk. It seems more to me that it was a choice. Like I touched on, the Eastern religions, and a country like India has largely been based on a milk diet, or has largely has produced mass quantities of milk, and people have historically had diets consisting of milk. And if we take a country like India, you could say India has been mass producing milk, and milk was considered an integral part of the diet for centuries, in fact, millennia. And we're not talking about a small population here either. The population of India was almost 100 million 1,000 years ago. And that's a population density that's greater than America is today. And during this time, Jainism was the dominant, or one of the dominant religions of India, along with Buddhism. And Jainism was based on this principle of non-violence to animals, ahimsa. It was a foundational principle of Jainism, to the point that it was even considered immoral to not sweep the floor in front of you when you walk, because you would be killing insects. Yet they advocated the consumption of milk, and they didn't consider production of milk on large scales to be immoral. So presumably there are ethical ways in which milk can be produced and consumed on large scales. And I'd just like to get your well, firstly, I'd say I think you're going to struggle to show how drinking milk from a cow is more immoral than not sweeping the floor in front of you when you walk. But obviously, I'd be interested to know what your justification is.
so yeah, so I I'm still hung up on the fact that the prop says product, because to me product means you're purchasing it from somewhere.
Yes.
So whether it be from a farm or from a store or from a restaurant or whatever. So I guess I just have to like get over that part.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's touch on that. Yeah. Should we touch on that first? So what I mean is is a consumer morally responsible for the methods which are used to create the product? Now, for example, I understand that there's this demand and supply principle, right? But if a product can be produced morally or in ethical ways, then can you blame the consumer for having a desire to have that product? I mean, is the consumer doesn't know the production methods necessarily. So, for example, I could maybe go through your wardrobe and find an item of clothing that was produced through questionable or unethical means, such as through a sweatshop in Bangladesh where child labor is used. But I wouldn't call you immoral or I wouldn't say it's immoral for you to purchase or wear that item of clothing. The moral, shall we say, the immoral act rests with the producer, not the consumer in this situation. And wouldn't you say that that applies here as well to the production of milk,
I
considering
actually
milk
disagree
can
with
be
that
produced?
entirely. Actually, I think consumers are morally responsible for their decisions. I personally, any clothing that I bought in the past that has been probably from sweatshops, that's being used by me until it's no longer of use anymore,
Mhm.
or I donate it. I only shop secondhand. I only um, like I don't buy new clothing. So that's one area where I'm completely like I'm completely, that's everyone's morally accountable for that. People are morally accountable for driving cars. People are morally accountable for every action that they do, for buying cars, for whatever. Like they're not an immoral person, but they
Yeah,
engaged in an immoral act. I'm not going to deny that or pretend that that's not a reality. So the same
right.
would follow for dairy consumption. And yeah, like So the only situation at this point that we could have, like, do you genuinely think that at some point we could have some sort of farming system where cows are not being killed for meat, and they're being not artificially inseminated, and their babies are not being taken away from them, and they have
Well,
enough land to graze? Do you really think that that's possible for the global population right now, or
well,
in the future at all?
Well, I don't see why not, because I gave the example of India, which had a population density greater than America does today 1,000 years ago, and they were practicing milk farming, dairy farming on a principle of ahimsa, non-violence to animals. So I don't know the exact methods they were using and whether they were using artificial insemination or whatever, I don't believe they were killing any cows in the process, and they were able to mass produce milk for the whole population. So I think there are probably ways that it could be done ethically.
I thought you said that it was just for the population of India.
Yeah, 75 million people.
Yeah, we have
Or
7
100
billion people, almost
yeah,
8.
but I'm talking on a country by country basis here, isn't it? Right? So
Right, so we would have
not
so much
so most
land in
milk
each
but
country
most
being
milk
taken
yeah,
up for
so
dairy farming. We wouldn't have farming for, like, we wouldn't have space for other things. Like, already 2/3 of the land's farming, or I mean, I'm sorry, of the land's, what is it, arable land or whatever, like farmable land is taken up by animal agriculture, whether it be crops to feed to animals in animal agriculture or for grazing livestock. And we would need even more for how high the demand is at this point. It's not feasible. You're saying that one country was able, like, how much land does India have, farmable land, grazable land, compared to every part of every other country? Like, that's
yeah,
something to consider as well.
admit yeah, admittedly, I don't know that, but as far as I'm aware, most milk isn't exported. It's produced, isn't it, within the countries? Is that right?
You're talking about what's exported from India?
Yeah. No, no, I'm saying most countries, I think, create their own milk, don't they? They don't import it from abroad. I think I'm right on that. I may be wrong, but I think,
I personally actually don't know that. I
yeah.
could try to look it up really quick, just see if I
No,
can
don't worry.
answer.
We'll just, I mean, okay, I'll grant that maybe it's not the case, but I would have, that's just a guess from me, to be honest, but one which is based in sort of just reason, I suppose. But what I mean is, no, the population of India 1,000 years ago was probably more dense than the population is of America today. Yet they were able to
Well,
mass produce milk. So I
there's
don't
at
see
least
why.
300 million people in America, I thought.
Yeah, exactly. But America's much bigger than India. I think it's over 3 times the size. I'm talking about just population density. So, the amount of land per person. So, if they could do it in ethical ways, I don't see why
Well, I would
countries.
have to see the ways that they're doing it, and even to consider that they're ethical. So we're talking about
Yeah,
something that we can't even look at.
true, but this is a society that said it was immoral to walk without sweeping the floor in front of you. So I don't think they would have used um, grossly unethical means to produce the milk. And that is a guess, but I think that's a reasonable inference to make. Um, I mean, the point is, I think it can be done, and I think there are ethical farms popping up all over the country, where
Well,
I am
I mean,
anyway.
well, what is ethical farms? Like, what are their practices? They probably still do take the babies away. Like, do you think that taking an infant, non-human animal away from their mammalian mother is moral or immoral, or do you not have a view on it? Or
I think it's a difficult question to answer, but my understanding is that that doesn't happen in many cases, right? I
that
understand
does
fact.
happen in many cases.
Does it? Okay.
Happens in
Well,
the majority of
okay. So, well, I would probably say I would probably remain agnostic on that issue and ask you what evidence you have to suggest that is a form of suffering.
Well, I would just point to, like, footage of whenever the babies are being removed from the mother, and the
Mhm.
cooing that occurs for days and days afterward from the cows. And you'll find that they use dairy cows for about 4 to 5 years before they're killed for meat, and during that time, like, they're just impregnated as soon as they can get pregnant, and then as soon as they have the baby, they're impregnated again, and then basically like as soon as they're able to get pregnant again, they'll re-impregnate them, and
Yeah.
you will find that some cows, I don't know how many cases, but I've definitely seen a lot of stories where from farmers themselves where like the mother will try to protect the baby cow because they know that the baby will be taken by farmers. So like in like an animal's natural instinct, obviously even humans natural instinct is to like breed or whatever. So it's like whenever your child is taken away from you, it's like you're losing your like entire what is it like idea of your existence, like your purpose of your existence, basically. Like you're just having that removed from you, and you're just being used as you're just being viewed as this product and as this like thing there for human pleasure, human consumption, whatever.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's a somewhat of a false equivalency because I think animals and humans. It's difficult, I understand, but a lot of people will argue that you can justify a difference in treatment of animals and humans because animals lack the eye, the subjectivity necessary to process the experience of pain and suffering. But
You don't think non-human animals feel pain and suffering?
no, no, well, they do. Well, I'm sure they do, but or I think they do, but maybe not to
Matter
the degree.
about the degree then, because so I could just read my other little paragraph that I made real quick.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Please do. But just before you do, I'll just say not to the degree that humans do, from what I think. But yeah, carry on.
So why should we grant moral value to non-human animals? Well, we already do in a sense if we are deeming factory farmers wrong. But just to make it clear why non-humans are much more similar to us than they are different. Sure, some may say they have less cognitive function or less of a subjective experience than humans, but this doesn't refute the fact that they do have a significant subjective experience. One is that is very similar to ours, and possibly even more than some humans, especially children. I know that they have the potential to grow up, but still, we wouldn't like a child that was stuck in a child body forever, like we wouldn't deem them less morally valuable than some other kid, you know what I'm saying? And the biggest similarities between us and non-human animals are our biological processes and the concept of emotions. Through extensive research and like thousands of studies, we have overwhelmingly determined that non-human animals not only have simple emotions like happiness or sadness, but they also have complex ones like feeling love, guilt, grief, embarrassment, etc., etc.
Embarrassment.
Yes. That I've read it, and like I can't link it right now. I could link it to you later if you want.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I've seen something about like domestic cats, like whenever they like fail in like like they try to jump and then they miss it or something and they fall, like they'll like have this look on their face and they'll like lick their lips, and it like a lot of
Right.
animal behaviorists have said that this is a sign of like embarrassment. And
Okay.
like dogs will feel guilt if like they get caught or something, like they will feel like, you could point it to like they're also just like nervous and stuff like that, but the connection
Yeah.
that they have to their
I
owner,
mean,
they don't want to disappoint them and things like that. That's just what animal behaviors say.
yeah. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, to use behavioral psychology in animals because, I mean, obviously, behavioral psychology in humans, the main thing we use is language, communication to understand. The person gives a subjective account of what they're going through and experiencing. Obviously, animals can't convey or communicate that information, so we're just guessing from reactions in their face and things. But as you say, licking
Well,
lips. I mean, how do we know licking lips means that they're feeling shame? It could mean they're feeling hungry for all we know. So it is a bit difficult, isn't it, in that sense?
right, but through extensive studies, they can do this. Like every single time a cat fails, they if they do something like that, that's got to point to they're not just hungry, they're reacting to what just occurred. Um,
Yeah, reacting, but we don't know what the feeling is, do we? They are reacting, I agree, but we don't know what the actual feeling that they're experiencing is.
right, we can
There's
only
no language
infer
to
based on the
communicate that.
idea that we have the same biological processes as them. We have brains, we have nervous system, a central nervous system, we have
Mhm.
blood like throughout our veins. Like we have veins. They're
Yeah.
like we have all these similarities that can like not only scientifically be like we can point to like similarities in feeling and stuff like that. Not like we can just intuitively understand it as well on a spiritual level even.
Well, that's where I would actually appeal to spiritual philosophy, which makes a clear distinction between the animal experience and the human experience. It says that animals can't experience a lot of these complex emotions that humans experience. But can I just come back to one issue? Because obviously we've gone down the factory farming route and also the production of milk and the methods of production, whether they're right or wrong. But did you concede, or do you concede that there's nothing inherently wrong in actually using an animal? For example, in actually milking the cow, consuming that milk when you don't have to, but you want to? Is there anything inherently wrong in that action that you see?
Yes, I do see something wrong with that action because the idea of viewing that entity as a means to your ends,
Yeah.
as a being that is there to serve you in some type of way,
Mhm.
I have a moral qualm with that. There's something wrong with that. The reason that there's something wrong with that is because it can lead to you treating them in other ways that are unjust, just because of this view that you have of them, and it's entirely arbitrary. It's not based on any real like facts or anything like that. Like we understand that the milk is biologically designed for a baby calf. It's not biologically designed for humans. Sure, we can get nutrients from it and get
Yeah.
benefits from it, whatever, but it also has other things that we don't want in it. It has naturally occurring hormones. Humans, adult
Okay.
humans do not need those hormones. They're not, they're not helping us in any way really. um,
Okay. I mean, I don't want to go down the route of whether it's necessary or not for the human nutrition. I'm not making a nutritional argument, but what
you
I
said
wanted,
if it's not necessary and you just want
yeah,
to.
yeah, I said if it's not necessary, so the human doesn't have to consume it, but they do it out of choice, right? But so you see something morally wrong in the actual the process of milking and consuming that milk, right? As a form of, do you see it as a form of exploitation of the animal? Is that right? Would you
Right,
see?
I would see projecting an objectification viewpoint onto the being
Mhm.
is immoral.
Right. So, but then would you have to argue then on those grounds that the use of any animal for any purpose is immoral? So, for example, historically, we used horses for transportation reasons. We used pigeons for, sending messages. I mean, are those acts immoral as well? Are they forms of exploitation?
Well, those are more based out of necessity, so that's different.
Well, I wouldn't argue it was necessary for people to move around on horses. For example, there were no horses in the Americas before the Europeans went there, and people got around fine. Pigeons sending messages isn't a necessity; it's more of a luxury, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say in cases where they don't need to, they shouldn't be.
Right.
That's
So
my
those were
position.
right. So those were forms of exploitation as well. What about dogs? Dogs used, for example, rescue dogs, police dogs, guide dogs for the blind. Are they immoral acts, or are they forms of exploitation of animals?
I would say that it's a form of exploitation, but there are justified forms of exploitation, I guess, for some people. I don't think that it's justified personally, but
Right.
I'm a subjectivist. I'm not going to tell someone
Yeah.
else that they're like, they cannot uh, view them that way. I'm going to tell them that I think it's immoral, and I'm going to try to convince them that it is, but I can't speak for somebody else.
Yeah, but that's what you're doing with the milk production, isn't it? You're saying that it is immoral and
I'm
convincing
trying
people
to
that,
convince you that it's immoral,
yeah,
based on your views. Yeah.
okay. And so you would try and convince the blind person that them using a guide dog is immoral and try and convince them to not to use a white cane or stick instead, right?
I mean, possibly, like, if I saw it as a situation where the animal was genuinely being like, it would I guess it would depend on the situation, because what's going to happen to that dog otherwise? Dogs are already a bastardization of a species. We've already, bred them out of complete whack, so what are you going to do with that dog? You're gonna put them in a shelter and kill them, or you're going to, like, what's going to happen to the dog? So there are cases where I can, like, be sympathetic. I can, whatever I think, whatever is best for both the non-human animal and the human involved. So Like, if you don't need to
Hmm.
consume the cow's milk, then don't consume the cow's milk. 'Cause, I mean, if
Okay.
you have a rescue cow that's just producing insane amounts of milk because they
Mhm.
were bred that way by humans, and you know they like they're not going to get pregnant again or whatever, then drink the milk. There's nothing wrong with that specifically, but a product that's what's wrong. So
Okay.
that,
So is it any animal product, for example, would you argue any animal product is a form of exploitation of the animal?
yes.
So let's say sheep's wool. I mean, shaving a sheep and using the wool to form clothes, that's immoral or
Yeah,
exploitation?
we bred those sheep to produce insane amounts of wool, as well. So if you have a rescue sheep and they're producing an insane amount of wool, and you shear them and use that wool, that's not immoral. But uh, that I wouldn't consider that a product. That at that point you're not selling it, and you're not
Yeah.
viewing the animal as a product either. You rescued them.
Yeah, but generally the process of shaving wool and creating clothes from that is immoral. The
Yes,
actual
for sure.
right, despite the methods they use. Okay. So the problem is, see, what I'm trying to get at here is that it becomes a little bit tricky because you're pretty much saying using any animal for any purposes is exploitation and immoral. But
That's
then,
my position. That doesn't have to be your position to
yeah,
understand that using animals as products is immoral whenever you don't need to, like,
I
especially whenever
know, but yeah, but the issue is, I think this sort of extends to wide. This has wider implications. For example, let's just take the. Do you think the state exploits you and exploits me because we're forced to work for
yes.
survival?
Mhm.
Right. So you think, so for example, um, people, right, they have to work to get money to put food on the table. If they don't work, they can't put food on the table, they can't survive. And is that a form of exploitation then?
Yes.
Right. So you would argue that what should be the alternative, that people shouldn't have to work. So let's say, for example, I could stay at home and play PlayStation all day and the state should provide me with money
No,
and food
I don't
and
think they should sit at home all day. I think they should, gather their own food. We should all be growing our own food, stuff like that. But this is really off topic, I feel like.
no,
It's
because
kind of
I'm trying
just
to get
like exploring my ethical viewpoints.
well,
Well,
no, because I'm
but
trying to get to the point of what I'm trying to get to your understanding of what exploitation is. Because I mean, we're all exploited to a degree, aren't we? Even in a relationship, you're exploited. I mean, you're never going to get two equal partners. One partner is always going to put in something more than they take out, and it's never going to be a 50-50 split exactly. So, I mean, we have to define what exploitation is, and I don't see how taking the wool of a sheep is exploitation, and I don't really see how taking the milk of a cow is exploitation. I mean, these let's take cows for example. Cows are very docile animals. I mean, what do they do all day? They sit around grazing. I mean, they're not exactly they don't migrate large distances naturally. They don't seem very active animals. They don't play around, isn't it? I don't really see where the exploitation comes from using them for milk.
well, the entailment of using them for milk is you have to get them pregnant somehow. You have to have this system in place. You have to be like viewing them as a product, and like if you're going to say that consuming a dairy product is not wrong, like to me that's entailing that there's some sort of system in place. So like I said, I gave you an example of where it's not quote unquote exploitation if you rescue a farm animal, because if you buy a farm animal, then you're buying them from a breeder who is profiting off of the breeding and selling and killing of those animals. So in the case,
Yes.
if you were to rescue a farm animal that was going to be slaughtered otherwise, and they're producing an immense amount of milk, and you were to consume some of that milk, I personally wouldn't view that as as an animal product at that point. I would just view it as an extra resource that's just being like wasted otherwise. So I wouldn't see that as
Yeah.
a product.
Yeah, and I agree. That's not a form of exploitation either. I agree with you there. But I mean, the point I'm trying to make is it exploitation to just, um, process or milk a cow for your own consumption on a farm? I mean, does the cow seem to object massively? Does the cow experience
I have
significant
to
levels of
I have to interject because like you're not giving me the rundown of how the farm is set up. You're not
right? Okay,
explaining to
yeah.
me.
So then, no, yeah, but that's going into another area of production. I'm just talking about consumption, right? So I just want to know whether you
But
think there's
consumption entails production because the
no, I
chicken
know
has to
that,
get
but
pregnant.
yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, no, and we will come back to that issue. I promise. But I just want to know whether there's anything inherently wrong in taking the milk of a cow and consuming it. Whether that actual process, forget about the production mechanism or how it comes about, but whether
Yeah.
like for example, I can say there's something inherently wrong about murdering somebody. It doesn't matter how they're murdered, right, or what the conditions were, but there's something inherently wrong about murdering somebody. Is there something inherently wrong about um, milking a cow and consuming that milk for your own purpose when you don't have to?
Yeah, taking their milk, whenever it's not this specific niche case that I pointed out, it is wrong.
Right. Okay. But then, I mean, again, this opens up it could go down a slippery slope here. So, for example, do you think parents asking their children to do chores at home is that a form of exploitation?
So I really don't wanna get into this. I wanna talk to you about how you feel about whether it's
Okay. Yeah, I will.
we're
Okay.
just directing
Yeah.
it to
Yeah.
some weird exploitation aspect of on my end, that which has nothing to
Right.
do with the debate. So we
No,
can
no,
have
that's
a
fair
separate
enough.
debate at some point, about what I think exploitation is if you want, but,
Yeah.
that has nothing to do with what's going on. So
Okay, that's a fair point. The only thing I was mentioning was that I personally don't think there's anything inherently wrong with using animals for products where you can obviously minimize the amount of distress caused to an animal. And the analogy I would give is that parents often, make their children do chores. So that could be seen as a form of exploitation. The parents are getting something out of their children. The children probably don't even want to do it and suffer a little bit. But we don't think of that as inherently exploitation because I suppose in return the child gets something back. They get food and shelter. And similarly here with the cows, they are getting a life. They're getting protection. They're getting shelter. They're getting fed. I don't see I don't see any inherent exploitation in using cows for production of milk.
okay,
But
so can you explain to me what the farm is doing in terms of how they're getting the cows pregnant and how and what they're doing with the babies that don't produce milk
yeah,
that have been bred into a specific breed of cow that produces more milk than they naturally would?
yeah, okay. So now we're getting into the ethics of the production method. Now,
Right,
as I
because
said,
that's part of the product.
yeah, okay. So firstly, like I said, I'm not too familiar with the production methods of milk. But like I argued, I think it is possible to create it in reasonably ethical ways, such as I believe was done in India historically, right, to feed millions of people. Um,
But we don't
so
know how that was done, like we talked about earlier. We don't know how that was specifically done, so we can't
yeah, I
talk
got
about whether it
that.
was genuinely ethical under our view or not. They
That
deem it as ethical, we know that, but we don't know if we do.
yeah, but I presume we would if they're sweeping the floor when they walk because they think it's
I don't
unethical.
know, I would just have to
Yeah,
see.
true, true, but, I think it's a reasonable presumption, isn't it? But, uh, the point I would say is well, the other point I would make is, I mean, even if, um, the methods used to produce milk are not ethical, the point I'm arguing is, can you blame a consumer for that? I mean, is the consumer morally responsible? Because if you say the consumer is morally responsible, then you're putting an onus on the consumer of any product to check
Right,
the
and we
origins of
talked
to
about
check
that
the
earlier.
origins. Can I just finish this point? To check the origins of that product. So let's say even if I go out and buy a television, I have to check, where the television was manufactured, whether there was any slave labor involved, whether the workers were paid minimum wage, whether they're treated well, whether they have to interview the workers and just make sure that they're not suffering for their labor. And so, I mean, it becomes quite impractical, doesn't it?
Yeah, I just disagree. I don't think getting a TV or not getting a TV is impractical. I think that it's perfectly fine to not have a TV. I don't have a TV. I don't see a need for a TV. There are TVs at used there are used TVs all over the internet and things like that. So you don't have to be purchasing a brand new one. There are lots of ways to get around this oh, products are inherently unethical aspect because they are inherently unethical whenever they're bought new in majority of cases. So we have to figure out how to work around that. We can't just say, "Oh no, it's not immoral at all." because that's just lying to ourselves. That doesn't help anything. That just perpetuates this culture of consumption and consumerism, and I don't
Yeah.
I'm not down with that. That's not how I operate. But that has nothing to do with whether you should view dairy products as wrong or not.
No, I think that's a respectable position, and I admire you for it. But I think, practically speaking, most people do have to buy certain items brand new, don't they? And for them to check the origins of every item they buy, even if it's food products, non-animal food products, for them to check the origins of all of their products, it just seems a little impractical.
I
And I
understand
don't,
that. I'm not asking people to be perfect saints. Like I think not consuming like animal products is like just like a baseline basically. But that's not the argument. It's not whether you should be vegan or anything.
no,
But yeah, I personally like I consume plants that come from the store. Like I know that animals were killed for that. I know that insects were killed for that. I'm aware of that, and I recognize that it was an immoral thing to do, but that doesn't make me an immoral person. But I'm not going
exactly.
to pretend that it wasn't an immoral act. I'm not okay with people not taking moral accountability for their actions. I'm not okay with that.
Yeah, and I to be honest, I'm probably not either. But my point is, I think the producers would have to take the moral burden lies with the producers, and
But it
they're the
also lies with the consumers because they need to speak up to their producers. They need to say this is wrong. They should be buying secondhand and then writing letters to the
one.
producers of the new products and saying this is immoral. You should change your methods. There are children being like enslaved for some of these materials.
Yeah, so that's I mean, obviously you can't buy secondhand milk, but that's a moral virtue. I mean, for
You could buy
example,
plant-based milk.
sorry.
You could buy plant-based milk.
Yeah, yeah, sure, yeah, but I mean, not everybody can have. Actually, it's very limited. I mean, that's another
I could
argument.
make plant-based milk very easily. There are billions of recipes online.
Yeah, but I think tribes in Africa and many remote tribes in many parts of the world, Afro-Asian countries are going to struggle with that, aren't they?
Yeah,
But
and you don't need plant-based milk or dairy milk to survive either.
that's true. That is true.
And if they're
And
doing it for necessity, then that's different.
yeah, I concede that point. But the point, sorry, we were just discussing is that the moral responsibility lies with a producer. And you're right. I think the consumer can still voice objections, right, and encourage the producer to change their methods. But I don't think their actual consumption per se is immoral, is it?
But you're like giving profit to the company that you're protesting against. That doesn't seem intuitive.
Well, yeah, so you're arguing for a boycott of the product, but I don't. Yeah, and a boycott of the product would be, you could argue, morally virtuous, but I don't think it's immoral or wrong to consume the product. So, for example, the difference is, um, let's say, for example, donating one of your kidneys to a stranger who has terminal kidney or severe kidney disease is a morally virtuous act, right? You're going above and beyond, but it's not immoral for you not to give that kidney, right? I think there's a distinction there. So similarly, I would argue that it's morally virtuous to boycott milk products, and it's
But I think
morally
it's immoral for you to pay for someone to get their kidney forcibly removed. Is that analogous?
probably
Sure.
not, probably not.
But
But
something similar, like you have to be, but you're not just doing an inaction. You're purchasing from the company that's
yes,
like I don't understand.
yeah. So you're right, and I would argue that if you're purchasing a product, right, which is inherently immoral. So, for example, if you're purchasing, I don't know, child pornography or something like that, right? We could consider that inherently immoral. But if you're purchasing a product which can and should be produced ethically, then I don't think you're doing anything
I
immoral. I
don't think
think the producer is doing the immoral act, not the
can it
consumer.
can it be produced ethically? Because I don't want to go back to
Yeah, well, that I
planetary
suppose, yeah, I suppose,
fantasy.
yeah. Well, this comes down to our definition of exploitation, but that's why I said I don't think it's exploitation to take milk from a cow. And also, I think it can be produced ethically because traditionally, historically, it has been done in many cultures in many parts of the world. So, and there are ethical farms. I mean, I've read up on a few ethical farms before our discussion, and they see what I've read about how they treat the cows does not seem immoral in any way to me.
I've also read some things from humane quote unquote farms
Yeah.
about how they quote unquote treat them ethically, but they say nothing about what happens to the calves. They say nothing about the insemination. They say nothing about the ugly stuff that happens. They say nothing about it. I looked to see if they did something ethical instead
Yeah.
of those things, and it said nothing. So that tells me, oh, okay, they're probably hiding something.
Oh, I see. So do you think they because I'm not aware of this, so you can fill me in. Are they still using artificial insemination methods, um, for impregnating the cows, even on these ethical farms?
I mean, it is something that is deemed humane, like in the dairy industry, is artificial insemination. So they're
Right.
allowed to do it. I don't see why they wouldn't do it. It's not financially
Okay.
viable to sit there and wait around for
Fine.
cows to get it on.
Okay. I'm not. I can't comment on that because I'm not sure. I mean, I've heard arguments from other people that say that's not used in all parts. In all, it's not it's not a an absolute practice, shall we say? But even if it was used, right? I'm not sure. I mean, how are you determining this suffer? Because I guess
Well,
your
I call
argument is
it bestiality and rape.
yeah, bestiality, right? Okay, and rape. Now, hmm, I mean, that's now how
You're
are you?
sexually assaulting the animal. You're either electrocuting their balls, or you're jerking them off, and you're injecting semen into a female's vagina, as well as sticking your arm down her anus
Mm,
to stimulate her cervix.
right. And I mean, on what grounds are you considering those to be,
Sexual assault.
well, I'd say suffering. I mean, yeah. On what grounds would you say that?
Because I can just understand that a human it has no place in the the biological production of other beings, of other
But what's
species.
your grounding for such a claim?
My grounding is that that's how their biological process is set up. We have to use some sort of human made, like man made methods in order to even do it.
Yeah, but it's still just your opinion, isn't it?
I mean, it's not just you can watch videos yourself of like cows that are like they have to put them in a thing called a cattle
Mm.
crush. Um,
But the actual act, I
right.
mean, is not, but the actual
Just
act.
said like the cows that need to be restrained. They have to be restrained, and you can watch
Mm,
videos of animals trying to get away. So, like, are
okay.
you going to try to tell me that just because the cow is getting jerked off, that means he wants to get jerked off? Like, I don't understand.
Well, it's very difficult to know what the desire of a cow is.
Well, if he's like trying to get out, then I assume that he doesn't want it happening.
Yes, I can, yeah, to a degree, go along with that. But I mean, we can't argue that artificial insemination per se is immoral because otherwise you'd have to argue that in vitro fertilization is immoral, right, in humans, and I don't think anybody would do that.
No,
Um,
that's with consent. We can't. Animals cannot give
yeah,
consent.
well, exactly. Animals cannot give consent, and that's a fundamental point here, isn't it? Because we can't, animals can't consent, right? So
So
they
we shouldn't
can't.
do it.
Pardon?
I'm sorry, I just interjected and said we shouldn't do
Yeah,
it.
no, no,
That
that's
was
okay.
rude.
So, yeah, so animals can't consent. So, I mean, there is a term called, isn't it? Because as humans, right, we often infer consent, or there is a term called implied consent, which is used often in medicine. So, for example, if somebody comes in unconscious, you can presume consent and operate on them or treat them accordingly, right, for their well-being. So, similarly, in the case of an animal like a cow, it can't consent. So, if I mean, there are certain processes you could or procedures you could do on the cow in the interest of both you and the cow. I mean, it's a symbiotic relationship, and you may argue there's no interest to the cow, but like I said, the cow is getting fed, it's getting
But there's no
shelter.
interest to the cow to even be born with how much we've like bastardized
Yeah,
other species. It's
right. So
not.
that's
It's not. It's not productive for them to exist
yeah.
for themselves.
Well, that's an anti-natalist argument, and and I'm not sure you can make the argument. For example, if a cow is born, it's looked after, it's fed, it's given shelter, um, and I mean, can you argue that that life wasn't worth living just because it was producing milk? I mean, what grounds are you using to make such an assertion?
Well, I mean, you can look up yourself. I mean, I should. That's why I said I wanted to get sources and stuff for this so that I can just
Yeah,
believe
sorry. Yeah.
it. But can you repeat what you just said one more time?
Yeah, so basically, lots of, I mean, even humans, lots of humans are born and they're born with difficult
Oh,
illnesses
I
or.
remember now. I remember now. Was the life worth living or not? So,
Yeah.
yeah. So there are plenty of there's plenty of information out there about cows. Like it's very common for them to get mastitis in the dairy industry, which is like a infection in their udder, which is like really painful for them.
Mhm,
And like it happens from like being hooked up to stuff. It happens from them living in their own
mhm,
shit. It happens from like
mhm.
plenty of stuff. And like the lives of chickens, like they you know they grow so big so fast that like their legs will just sometimes just break right under them, under like the distress, um and like
Yeah, but
that's a
let's
separate
stick to
thing, that's
cows
not
and
dairy,
milk.
but yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Mhm.
um but
Yes.
yeah, like and if if you're saying that they're being fed and blah blah blah, but like they're also being restrained and confined and artificially inseminated, quote unquote, right, in my under my view. They're having their babies taken from them. They're having to constantly just like
Mhm,
be under control of humans up until the point that they're killed. Or if you're talking about a case where that's not happening, then they've still been bred to like produce way more milk, which is like than is natural to them. So I would imagine that even just that in itself like could create some hormonal problems inside their body. Who knows? There could be studies out there about that.
yeah,
I'm not sure,
but I
but
think,
I just think it's intuitive to understand that the amount of selective breeding that we've done to these animals, to the degree that we've done it, to the amount of milk that's produced by a cow these days, is
mhm,
just it's not like I don't the cow has got to be constantly under distress and like feeling inflammation and everything like that. And like this has nothing to even do with like sicknesses that they could I'm pretty sure like they're more subject to like they could have autoimmune diseases. Like I'm gonna look it up really quick while you're talking.
okay. Can I jump in while you're doing that then?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so, I mean, the issue is, right, humans also can suffer immensely. They can have horrible diseases throughout their life, childhood, even adulthood, cancer we can think of, other autoimmune diseases. Yeah, I don't think we can automatically say, "Oh, it would have been better if they weren't born." Obviously, that's a subjective um, decision that only that person can make. Um, and many humans have a life full of pain and suffering, but still think it is worthwhile to have lived. So I don't think you can automatically say, "Oh, it would be better off for this cow to have never been born."
Well,
Um,
it's our job for both non-human animals and for humans that do not have the cognitive function to like think for decisions for themselves and things like that. It is our job to infer what is best for them. And in a
yeah,
lot of cases where humans like have been born with these defects and stuff like that, we will take care of them. And I think that we should do the same for the cows that have been bred into existence. But I don't think that we should continue breeding them into existence. Like I wouldn't breed somebody who has like the cognitive function of a non-human animal. Like I wouldn't breed that person. I wouldn't allow that person to breed because then you're just subjecting like another being to suffering. You get
well,
what I'm
that's a
saying?
controversial. Well, that's a very controversial point. So you're arguing there for the abortion of anybody, of any fetus which has a disability, and I think many people would
No,
argue
I'm
that.
not saying that. Not any fetus with a disability. How would that
No,
fall?
not any no, sorry, not disability, any disability with a severe disability, and I think some people would argue, no, it's more ethical to actually, conceive that child and then the
Okay,
state.
well, if they want to do that, they can. I have no issue with that, but they're not breeding that being into existence to be used as a product. That's completely different.
Yeah, but that's a different argument. Then we're back onto the issue of whether what exploitation is and whether they are actually being exploited. Um, but I think,
I don't see how it's a different argument.
well, because one argument is about whether, um, an animal should be brought into existence to suffer or suffer according to you. And then you're adding on this extra element to say, what was it you said? Sorry, this extra element to say that we're using them as a product. But I mean,
Right,
the
right, like humans that are born into like a situation where they're not like, on a cognitive function level, they have people to take care of them. They have people that care about them, they're not going to be used as a product or anything like that. So they don't have anything to worry about. Like, we don't have to worry about their safety or their comfort or anything like that. And in the case of not of like cows that are born into the dairy industry and things like that, I think that they should be given sanctuary until they die. I don't think that they should all just be killed, but they shouldn't continue breeding. So there's a difference between somebody getting pregnant and their baby has defects, and breeding cows into existence that have defects. That's completely different.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I suppose I can, yeah, understand where you're coming from with that. But so the typical life of a cow, right? So you would say that the typical life of a cow on one of these ethical farms, shall we say, where certain practices still possibly go on, like artificial insemination, but you're saying the typical life is still a life not worth living. It's
It's
still a
still
life.
it still entails suffering,
Mhm.
and it's still a life of serving another species.
Right. Okay. So two components there. The first, it's still a life of suffering, but don't all animals in the wild have the same? Maybe one could argue a higher degree of suffering, right? They have to avoid predation. They have to.
That has nothing to do with this argument.
No, it is because the point is the
We're
cow.
not we're not doing that to those animals though. We're not sending the predators towards them or anything like that. We are putting these animals into existence.
Yeah, but my point is, I mean, you're saying that these cows are. Oh, right. Okay. So you would argue that it's actually it's there's something inherently immoral about wild animals conceiving.
What?
Well, I
Why?
suppose
Where'd
we're
you
not.
get
I
that?
suppose yeah. Well, not immoral, but you see something difficult about it. Like you see suffering for wild animals.
I do see suffering for them, but I don't feel a moral obligation to them as I do to the cows, because I'm not doing that to them. We're doing it to the
Mhm.
cows.
And that's the distinction, is it? That's what makes it. That's what makes it wrong. That's what makes it wrong, in your opinion. The fact that humans are doing this to the cows, whereas in the wild it happens naturally.
Yeah, and some people you will speak to would have a different opinion. They may feel that humans are obligated to step in for predators and things like that. I don't have that position. I think that the way that the natural order works, that has nothing to do with me. But the way that we have bred cows, the way that we have, and like how we're treating them now, I can definitely recognize that that is immoral.
Okay. And just when I came back to the point, did you think that people should sweep the floor in front of them when they walk?
I don't necessarily have an opinion on that. I personally, I look at the ground whenever I walk outside. Like, I try not to step on bugs. I'm sure that I do,
Mhm.
but I'm not claiming to be some perfect being or anything like that. I just
Mm.
express
But
how I feel.
okay, but in your mind, what we do to cows is worse than walking around without sweeping the floor in front of you. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And what was the second? Do you remember the second point you made? You made one about the cow suffering, and then the second point, which I wanted to come back to. I think I've forgotten. Do you recall what it was?
Wait, can you repeat it? What?
Yeah. Do you remember that second point you made? You made 2 points. One was the cow suffers when we breed
What
it into
point about
existence.
what again?
Well, no, just recently you made 2 points, and I said I'll take them separately. The first one
Oh,
was, do you remember this? I can't remember it, so don't worry if you can't.
something about I talked about the suffering, and I talked about the production. I don't know.
Okay, don't worry, it's okay. So
Sorry.
no,
We
no, no,
could
it's
go
okay.
for closing statements soon if you'd like, but if you want to keep going, I'm totally fine.
Yeah. Well, do you have any questions for me or any other points you wanted to make?
I mean, I would just try to, like, I get that you don't view the idea of just milking a cow and consuming it as an immoral act. And I think that we can almost agree on that, but I can't agree to the proposition just because I am hung up on the fact that it says product, and I view product as something that either you are purchasing or you are like using for yourself. And even I think you even said that you disagree, that it would be immoral to do it, like if we don't like, if like if we don't need to, like you're still fine with us doing it, and I want to understand why that is still, because like I, I we have to recognize that there is a process involved, and we have to determine whether or not that process is ethical for us. So I would just need to understand, you know, how much moral consideration you give to animals and why that moral consideration doesn't extend to not viewing them as a product or like a there for your specific use.
Yeah, because I think well, when you say there for your specific use, I think I don't think see anything inherently immoral in animal products or using animals per se. So, for example, the wool of a sheep, I don't see a problem in that. Using horses for transportation, I don't see a problem in that. Dogs for various tasks, I don't see a problem inherently, an inherent problem in that. And similarly, um, I don't see an inherent problem in plucking apples from a tree. I don't think you would either. Whereas a tree is an organism, isn't it? But we can use its products without feeling morally bad. So similarly, I don't see a problem inherently in using the milk of a cow, and I don't think the cow really minds as well. I mean, this is why I come back to a little bit of religious philosophy of religious theism. Is actually argued in Jainism or in Hindu. In the Vedas, I believe that the cow is designed to give you milk, and they encourage you to take milk from the cow and use the milk. It's the cow's purpose almost, right? And I understand that this is a wishy-washy religious
Yeah,
argument,
that's
which I'm probably not going to hold to. But sorry.
I would just argue that it's just human centric and it's arbitrary.
Yeah, well, but then I guess your position, I mean, our positions are arbitrary, aren't they? You've admitted that your morality
It's
is
not
subjective as
arbitrary.
well.
I make inferences based on my observations and my like my understanding
Yeah,
of biology.
I understand, but essentially the moral argument is arbitrary, is subjective, isn't it? So I'm just saying that there are these references to the idea that actually these animals, actually, it's almost like their purpose in life. And I think when you think of domestic animals, right, they do get the protection from people. They get sheltered, they get food, they get um, protection from predators. I don't think it's much there's anything wrong in asking for something back from them. I don't see that as exploitation. Like I said, any relationship has a degree of give and take. It's symbiosis, right? And so that's why I struggle with the point that now eating them is a different issue, right? And I don't want to go into discuss that, but just using the products, replenishable products. The wool from a sheep is replenishable. The milk from a cow is replenishable. And I think, from what I understand, there are ethical ways which these things can be produced, mass produced. It's just possibly because of cost they aren't done so at the moment. But I think, as you said, if the consumer um, can voice some protest or maybe put pressure on the production companies or whatever the farmers to produce these products in a more ethical manner, then that's a good thing. I think that's a moral virtue, but I don't think we can blame the consumer for consuming them or desiring them.
Okay, would you consider that your closing statement?
Yeah, let's call that my closing statement.
Okay, so I would just, continue. It's kind of gotten circular at this point, so I feel like I'll
Mhm,
probably be repeating myself a bit, but um,
mhm,
I, basically just understand that these non-human animals, they feel very similar to the ways that I do. They, through extensive research, through like all like animal behavior scientists, they're all in agreement that animals have emotions. They have, they should be granted moral consideration. And the products that, as it stands, we are in agreement that those are immoral, and we should, try to find ways to like reconcile that, change it, find ways to be more ethical, but I guess we just disagree on the fact that I'm an abolitionist and you seem more of like a welfarist. So I don't think that it can be financially or resourcefully viable to feed the entire human population with dairy products. I don't think that we would have enough land. I don't think that we would have enough water. I don't think that we would have enough crops. So neither of us have the empirical data for that. So we'll just have to kind of fly off of our intuitions. I just see it as we are not even able to feed everybody right now. I understand a lot of that is systemic, but the longer that we are, continuing the feeding and breeding and all of this stuff with non-human animals, the longer it's going to take for humans to be able to sustain themselves off of the resources that the earth provides. So, and I think that, if we are theists and we, believe in spiritual reasoning and things like that, we should be granting as much moral consideration to our fellow beings that we can on this planet. And to me, that would include, not consuming their lactations that are biologically designed for their offspring if we don't need to. We like it doesn't really better us as a species at this point. I outlined a lot of things in this debate related to that. So that's basically my position, and that's it.